so why am I landing only in the Gospel of John? Because I had thought about going through all the miracles, or looking at all the miracles that Jesus did in chronological order and just handpicking. But as I was going to highlight some of the miracles of Jesus, I studied them and I'm looking at them going, there are 37 plus miracles. How do I choose between them, right? But as I was doing some research, I discovered, if you want to look at the handout that's on the bottom of your outline. So I was looking at these and I was going through them, reading through them. But here's what stood out to me. If you look at the numbers on top, the 22 out of 3, so 22 of these miracles are recorded in Matthew, but only 3 of them are isolated in Matthew. There are 20 miracles recorded in Mark, but only 2 are isolated in Mark only. In Luke, there are 21 miracles, but only 6 are isolated in Luke only. But in John, technically there are 8 miracles and 6 of those are isolated only in John's gospel. So I was just really intrigued by that. And so other than the fact that God told me to do this, I'm like, this is what I'm fascinated by this. So we're going to go into and look at this. So you keep that for your reference. And I would encourage you, read through the miracles, all of them in chronological order. But that's what we're going to do, as is studied in and revealed in the book of John. So it was also interesting to me that there are some that say there are 8 miracles in John, but some say that there are only 7. So most scholars only account for 7 miracles, not the 8 that are labeled here. Some do not count Jesus walking on water as a miracle because it was a private event simply for his disciples. No one else witnessed it. It was just something that Jesus did. Others, for different reasons, don't count the second miraculous catch of fish, which is the last one on your document. For various reasons, some say that the 21st chapter was added later. Okay, so all that to say, it doesn't matter that which one is or wasn't counted as a miracle. It is mostly unanimous belief among scholars that there are 7 signs as recorded by John. They differ on which one doesn't count, but they all agree that there are 7, of all which all the miracles have a deeper spiritual meaning to prove Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God. So that's one of the reasons they debate whether Jesus walking on water or the last one was. So the other thing is that the 7 signs, the 7 miracles coincide with the 7 I am statements that are found only in the Gospel of John. And scholars also say that since John is the author of the book of Revelation, there are some Holy Spirit inspired correlations with the number 7 that is throughout the book of Revelations. That is just point of interest, but we are going to look at all 8 as recorded, but consider the fact that the 7 are Holy Spirit inspired. And we'll kind of study that at the end as to what we think about all of that. Okay. All of that led me to do a deep dive into the miracles that John records in his gospel. At this point, well, I will say too, I forgot to mention, some scholars say that the feeding of the 5,000 it is the only other miracle recorded in all the other gospels. So if you take out Jesus walking on water, that is the only one really that John lists that other gospels include as well. Does that make sense? So at this point from chapter 1, we learn that Jesus has 5 disciples right now: Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel, and John. And he is now beginning his 3rd day of his official ministry. This explains why only John records the first miracle, because he was the only one of the gospel writers that was actually there as a disciple at that time. So firsts really matter, don't they? I mean, don't we always talk about firsts? Like my first trip to Disneyland, my Ayla's first trip to Disneyland, first steps, first tooth, first words. We always think about and record. Those are memorable events, right? Even this wasn't Ayla's first trip to Disney, but it was her first trip that she was tall enough to do new rides. So there's something exciting and enamoring about firsts. And the same is actually true scripturally. Before, if you've been here long enough, you know that I've talked about the law of first mentioning when studying the Bible. Okay, so whatever you're reading, you always go back and see, where did this first happen? Where was it first recorded? There are things that we learn about Jesus by understanding that this is his first miracle. Okay, so we want to look at it with this enamoring idea of what is Jesus revealing as his first miracle. So, first are milestones in a child's life. First in the Bible are also milestones that we should always go back to. Okay, so let's dive into the passage together. We're reading in John 2, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. We'll just read the whole thing and then we'll go from there. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Interesting transition there, right? Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. I cannot talk today. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, John calls this a sign as opposed to a miracle. This is again because Jesus, what he is doing is a sign or a symbol that points to the deity and the Messiah, as Jesus being the Messiah. And on this particular occasion, this is specifically for his disciples. Okay. It isn't that his disciples didn't believe. He said, and his disciples believed in him. It's not that they didn't believe. They believed in him. They followed him. A better explanation of the Greek words here would be his disciples believed into him. So that is an original translation, meaning that what Jesus did caused them to submerge themselves into his person, his character, even more so than they had already committed to do. Okay, that's important because we need to understand John records everything in his gospel as to point to Jesus as the Messiah. Okay, so at this point, his disciples believed into him. You really are the Messiah. Okay, so we're going to dive in. Lessons learned from the first miracle of Jesus. Number 1, Jesus shows up when he's invited. And the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. So at this time, Jesus is up by his hometown, Nazareth. So Cana, where he was at, was only 9 miles away from his hometown. This is important because people at this wedding would have known Jesus as the son of Mary and Joseph, right? Nothing more. And the fact that Jesus and his mother were invited would indicate that this was a close friend of the family or even a family member or relative that was getting married. So that says something about the character of Jesus that made people want him to be included in their celebrations. So already Jesus's character was being well known, not as Messiah, but as a person. Okay. They wanted to include him, not just for what he would do, because he really hadn't done anything yet. They wanted to include him for who he was. He was invited because of the kind of man he was, and he showed up because of the kind of man he is. In fact, in many of the miracles written in the Gospels, Jesus was invited to be present for his healing power, but here he was simply invited for who he was. Okay? How often, though, is Jesus the last one invited into our circumstances? Right? Is he invited into our everyday mundane tasks? Or is he invited when all seems lost and as a last resort? How often do we go to a friend before we go to Jesus? Right? I'm just talking about myself. I'm not pointing fingers, right? This is me too. Is he invited to every conversation? Is he invited into every thought? Tiffany had a perfect example on the way here. That was inviting Jesus into that moment instead of living in it and walking in it. But it's something to think about. If Jesus shows up when he's invited, how often are we inviting him? It's on us to do the inviting, right? Do we make it a practice to invite Jesus based on his love and character and deity in our life, or just out of desperation of what we want him to do? Here he was invited to a wedding for who he was. Can we learn to practice inviting Jesus into everything because of who he is first and foremost, not what we want him to do? The latter is not wrong, but the first constitutes a relational equity, okay? He's not going to impose. He wants to be invited. And he will always be faithful to respond because, number two, this miracle also shows us that Jesus cares about what we care about. So you would think that he would have performed a much more lavish and public miracle for his first one, right? At a place where hundreds and thousands could see that he is the Messiah. Instead, he performed his first miracle at a private gathering. There was no healing, no raising of the dead, no exorcism, just a chance to make a party a little happier, right? A wedding was a very big deal, though. You need to understand this, especially back then. It was a huge, extravagant celebration that lasted about 7 days. A bride would get ready at their home, and a party would come to her and gather her and escort her to the groom's house. And back in those days, the groom was the one who paid for the wedding, not the bride's family. The groom and his family are responsible for the cost of everything, and it was expected to be a spectacular event with food and drink and celebration and even a parade. After the ceremony, the bride and groom would be paraded through the streets for the long route back to their home so that the people who were not invited to the wedding would give well wishes all along the way. So it's a big deal, okay? To run out of wine was a huge social embarrassment. It was so serious that the groom's family would be disgraced and shamed and have to live with this embarrassment for the rest of their lives. They would be talked about, disgraced. In fact, this could have been grounds for a lawsuit to run out of wine. The bride's family could bring charges in a court of law for not providing an ample amount of wine at the wedding. Wine was a symbol of joy. To run out of it at a wedding was doomsday for that marriage. And even in Psalm 104, it says, he gives the wine that gladdens the heart of men. Okay, so it was a symbol of joy. Not only would joy be lacking, reputations were at stake. Jesus could have dismissed this, but he had compassion on the bride and groom. It was a way to bring them joy. He cared about them and what mattered to them. He cared about their future. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But knowing that Jesus cared about what they cared about, he cares about what we cared about, we also need to understand that Jesus needed permission to perform this miracle. Through this miracle, we also learn that Jesus is surrendered to his Father. Number 3. Jesus is surrendered to his Father. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And Jesus said to her, woman, what does that have to do with me? My hour is not yet come. His mother turns around, right around, doesn't respond, and said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. So It's interesting that Mary brings the issue of running out of wine to Jesus. Maybe because she was eager for him to miraculously demonstrate that he was Messiah. In chapter 1, we see that he was told that he was the Son of God, right? Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. She would have known that he had been baptized. She would be anticipating him stepping into his role of Messiah, okay? After all, when people saw that Jesus was Messiah, wouldn't it also vindicate her after living under the shadow of a pregnancy and birth that many people questioned, right? You can only imagine how anxious she would be for Jesus to reveal himself and hopefully cure her tainted reputation. Probably the reason she brought the issue of running out of wine to Jesus. This is important to know when you read Jesus' response. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." First of all, if I or my siblings ever called my mom woman, I would be backhanded and sitting on the floor. But in that culture, at that time, this is actually a polite term. It's a formal term. It's not degrading, but it wasn't intimate. It wasn't harsh. It was as if we today would say, ma'am, or other countries, my lady, okay? He was speaking with a term of respect, but we need to understand he was not referring to her as mother. This was to say that as of now, today, he will have a different relationship with Mary. Mary brought this request to him as mom, but he's responding saying, we no longer have that relationship. Why? Woman, what does this have to me? In Greek, this is literally translated, what do you and I have in common that you should make this my concern? Okay, so this is a transition time. She is no longer the one in charge. He has obeyed her, but from now on, he has to consult his Father for all things. He wasn't basically saying, I won't do it. He was reminding her that he must be about his Father's business now. Okay, so, but her response enhances this as a call to surrender to Jesus as the Son of God, because she immediately response was not to Jesus, okay, whatever you do, consult, do whatever. Her immediate response wasn't to Jesus, but to the servants. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. So Mary got the message, right? These were the last recorded words of Mary. Did you know that? Do whatever he tells you. Not only now, but in all the upcoming encounters yet to come. I declare him as Son of God. I acknowledge it. I want you to acknowledge it. Do as he tells you, whatever he tells you. Follow his teachings. Surrender to his ways, just as he has done in this moment by declaring, my hour has not yet come. Okay? So it's not that he could have performed this miracle. The reason they say my hour has not yet come, and the reason this miracle is strictly for the disciples, is because his hour had not yet come to perform the miracle in such a way that everybody would be witness to it. Okay? So we're going to go through that. But think about that. If these are the last recorded words of Mary, isn't it important we know if the things we are saying are the last things we're going to say? What would we have being recorded? That's a harsh one sometimes, right? Would what we say, if it were the last thing, point to the Father, point to the Son of God? If we are to emulate Jesus, we are to embody surrendering. And I was going to mention this earlier, but I saved it for now. Surrendering should be a part of every single message that we talk about, every single talk and teaching that we do on a Sunday. And that was why last week was a perfect setup for this series. Because if we want to experience and encounter Jesus the way these people did, it's a matter of surrendering. And just as Jesus in this moment says, I am surrendering to the Father, I will only do what the Father asks me to do, we must do the same way. But it's also interesting to note that in Jesus's first miracle, he not only was surrendered to the Father, but he emulated the Father. because the first act of God was what? Creation, right? And the first act of Jesus was creation. He created wine out of water. And we're going to go through more of that in just a minute. But just as with the creation of God, number 4, what we learned from this is Jesus goes above and beyond. The creation of the universe is above and beyond what any of us could fathom, right? So let's go into why Jesus goes above and beyond. First of all, consider the 6 stone water jars holding 20 to 30 gallons each. That's between 100 and 180 gallons of water. That's a lot of wine. It's estimated that there were less than 100 people at this wedding. So far more wine was produced than was needed. Why that much? Scholars say that this would have been a lavish gift, not only for the event, but for the couple, because the couple could take the remaining wine and live off the profit of it for a very long time. They could utilize it, sell it, and they would be set for a very long. Jesus didn't just take care and care about the moment. He cared about their future as well and provided far beyond that immediate moment. He says, I'm going to give them such a blessing beyond their immediate need. One scholar says this, that no small gifts fall from so great a hand. How often do we ask for the minimal when God wants to give above and beyond? Ephesians 3:20, the beginning of it says, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than we ask or think. Everything that Jesus does is not for earthly benefit, but for eternal benefit. And of course, he wants to give big when it comes to that. That couple would have pointed to the fact that they lived off that profit for a very long time, right? We can dream, and Jesus will still overachieve. We can ask big, and he will still go bigger, because it isn't about us. It's about pointing things to him, that these are things we could never have accomplished on our own. Okay. Do we expect small gifts, or do we elaborate on the possibilities that God can do abundantly more? Verse 8, and he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. Master of the feast is like the MC, the coordinator of the ceremony. Jesus insisted, this is really important too, Jesus insisted that the miracle be put to test right away. He didn't command that the water that was made wine first go to the guests. He said, no, I want you to test it by the proper authority and do it right away. Now, we don't know when the water turned to wine. Was it when it was filled? Was it when they drew from it? Was it when they drank? We don't know. But the fact is, it happened somewhere in the midst of this process. So then the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. Jesus's wine was considered better. It was the best. Even the wine Jesus offered was better than what they could have purchased or provided on their own. So again, Jesus wants to go above and beyond in our lives so that it points to him and only him. But we have to invite him to do so. We have to trust that he has the compassion for our lives and cares about what we care about. And we have to believe that he will, as mentioned here, fill us to the brim. Why is that important that he included that? Why is it important that they said, and they filled them up to the brim? Because it is important to know that there is no possible chance that anything was added to that pot. They were consumed with water. No possible way to explain this miracle away. Jesus didn't add anything. He transformed something. And in that moment, Jesus did what should have taken years. A magician could have done something similar, but Jesus transformed it. Charles Spurgeon says this about being filled with the brim. This is a pattern for our faith and obedience. When you are bidden to believe in him, believe him up to the brim. When you are told to love him up to the brim. When you are commanded to serve him up to the brim. That's what the servants did. They didn't have fill it with water. They said, oh, hey, he said, fill it with water. We're going to do just that in full obedience. Fill it to the brim, which leads to possibly the most important lesson of this miracle. Number 5, Jesus wants to include us in the process. Verse 7, Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw, take out some to the master of the feast. So they took it. And then when the master tasted the water, now wine, and didn't know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. So the master of the ceremonies, he didn't know where the wine came from. He didn't ask. The bridegroom, he didn't know. The only people that knew that this went from water to wine were the disciples and the servants. The guest never knew what happened. The servants were the one that witnessed the miracle. Jesus chose them to partner with him in this first miracle. Jesus could have filled the water up. He could have done all of it, all on his own. But imagine how much faith this took on behalf of the servants. Imagine how angry the master of the feast would be if they brought him water to taste. Yet in faith, they took water and did what Mary told them to do what Jesus told them. I mean, think about that a second. How much faith would that have taken for a servant to go to the person in charge and gamble that they just saw water and they drew it out to find wine? So the servants didn't do the miracle. Their efforts alone were completely insufficient. But because of their obedience to Jesus, they shared in the joy of the miracle. So servants experience the power of God in obedience in ways that those who just show up will not. So look again at Ephesians 20 I mentioned earlier, but let's read the whole verse. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power at work within us. Do we miss out because we don't invite Jesus into events and circumstances on a regular basis? Or has skepticism tainted our belief in the fact that there is a power at work within us that can do and partner with Jesus to do miracles? This is a question that I asked because in doing this study, I actually read several commentators, those who write the commentaries and explanations of the Bible verses, right? There are some very well-known commentators that have problems with the miracles of Jesus. William Barclay is a well-known author of commentaries who is so thorough. It's from him I get a lot of the history, a lot of the Greek and language translations. He's good with culture and geography of a particular text, but he does not acknowledge the power of Jesus to perform miracles. So when you get to the commentaries where he writes, he has an example or a reason to explain them away. Here's one example. Barclay refers to the feeding of 5,000 as a misdirective truth. His truth that is, everyone brought their own lunch and hid it. They got convicted. All the people, the 5,000, got convicted when Jesus got this kid to come up and bring his lunch. And therefore they were embarrassed and suddenly everyone had food that they were pulling out. That's his explanation for the feeding of the 5,000. I could go on. And the walking on the water. It's because he was so close to the shore and the moonlight hit things just perfectly or whatever, that it was a misdirection of your mind, right? An illusion. Again, I could go on, but the point is, even God-fearing people don't believe Jesus truly performed miracles. With each passing generation, miracles are more often dismissed or explained away by science. One scholar said this: Christians in general either overnaturalize miracles or they minimize them. When a baby is born, that's a miracle. He says, not really, the true definition of a miracle. A baby's birth is a natural design and law. You can have a miracle birth because the baby almost died, but the actual process of a baby being born is a natural design. Or it's a miracle that I found a parking place close to the door. You know, again, we overuse the word to the point that it waters it down. And he says, suddenly the term miracle and reality of it is watered down or misunderstood. He goes on to define a miracle as this: a miracle is a divine work of God that transcends human understanding and inspires wonder, displays the greatness of God, and causes people to recognize that God is active in the world. He also says to believe a miracle is a miracle, you just need to go back to Genesis 1:1 and believe that first thing that God did was a powerful, miraculous creation of the heavens and the earth. But people have dismissed that as not being a creation. Science has tried to explain it away, right? I struggle with this because I do believe miracles still happen, but I think it's 40% of God-fearing Christians do not believe that miracles still happen, that they are not a part of God's plan or design anymore, that the last miracle actually happened when Jesus ascended to heaven. And yet they still go on to explain away the miracles that are written in the Bible. So that is the challenge to me, is are we willing to believe and accept the invitation, not only from Jesus to partner with him as his servants, things that he could do all by himself. Are we willing to partner with him in a way that we will believe he can do miracles, big and small? Where are we at on that thought pattern of believing in miracles in our lives? I would never have asked that question had I not realized that one of the greatest commentary writers does not believe them as miracles. So that is my challenge. What do we think about miracles? Have we experienced them? The challenge today is to truly believe that God is a God of miracles and act like it. Our whole book of James was you learn something, then you act like it. How are we going to act like that we will surrender to the fact that we can partner with God and have miracles performed in us, through us, and around us? I debated on sharing this, but I still debate on sharing it, but I'm going to go for it. Firsts are important. And we've just learned a lot of things about the first miracle of Jesus, right? I have experienced several miracles in my life, not defined by anything science, only defined by an act of God. The first one that I experienced in my life, I'm going to share briefly about. In the fall of 1998, I was attending Southern Nazarene University, at which time I was facing huge, insurmountable struggles. My sister had just almost died from a blood clot after childbirth. I was being accused of, by officials of the university, I was being accused of being gay because I was friends with two girls who were in a relationship together. Like, I can't have them as friends. The rumor mills spread. Students started believing the same thing and talking about me. A couple of professors had told me that as a female, I should not be pursuing the religion major that I was in at the time, or speaking as a female. And on top of all of that, in this short 1 to 2 week span, I was rear-ended by a 16-year-old and suffering neck and back pain. So there was emotional, physical, spiritual attacks all over the place. I was completely down and depleted. And I didn't have this family support system, you know, and I didn't know of my friends who believed that I was in this gay relationship or not. I just didn't have anybody that I felt like I could go to. I was also given a plethora of muscle relaxants and pain meds. And I also realized at that time that it didn't just numb the physical pain, it was numbing the emotional pain. It wasn't that I wanted to die, I just didn't want to live in that moment anymore. So one pill led to another, and man, that felt good. Then it led to another. Oh, that feels better. Oh, that led to another and another. And I remember beginning to black out. I don't know if you've ever gone under anesthesia and you kind of just know you're drifting and then you're suddenly there. I remember at that point, I realized what had happened. It wasn't intentional. It was a process that the enemy led me down. At that moment, I remember crying out to Jesus. I invited Jesus, and he had compassion on me. And within an instant, I went from nearly comatose to vomiting everything up like that. In the medical field, you know that's not heard of, right? All that to say, it was in an instant as if I had not taken anything. My mind was clear. My thoughts were clear enough to say, hear Jesus tell me, we aren't done yet. I surrendered to the circumstances of my life to Jesus that time, right then. At that point, up until then, I had surrendered to other people's voices. I had surrendered to circumstances. Jesus says, no, look at this. You need to surrender to me because look what I can do. That miracle is why I keep saying yes to Jesus. That first miracle had an impression and an impact. My question is, do you have a first miracle encounter with Jesus? What is it about that miracle that is a constant reminder of the compassion of Jesus, the relational investment he wants to make in you? Or about this first miracle that we just read about? What about it resonates with you that says, I want to have that encounter, that relationship, that partnership with Jesus, and revive the idea that miracles are still possible? If you have not experienced a miracle firsthand, there's nothing wrong with you. It's just time to invite that. Invite him to do above and beyond anything that you can ask or imagine.